Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about the Churches of Christ. The Churches of Christ are the churches that I grew up in, and while I don't share all of the beliefs of the Churches of Christ now, I do appreciate having grown up in it. I'm not one of those bizarre secularists who says I was forced to go to church and it was child abuse in the agony and I have religious trauma syndrome from it. But I'm also not someone who shifted to something like an evangelical and am now denouncing them as teaching some works-based salvation as false and all that, or condemning them for legalism. Rather, I actually appreciate the Churches of Christ and still agree with a great deal of what they teach. And it isn't simply because I was indoctrinated as a child before I learned critical thinking and I didn't question it. I questioned everything. But their beliefs are logical, and they do make sense if you follow their premises. I just disagree with certain conclusions they have drawn on certain issues, one of which is, in fact, an issue that is almost never addressed online when discussing the Churches of Christ, and that is their stance on miracles, because the Churches of Christ are cessationist, and cessationists believe that the apostles were granted power to work miracles by Jesus, and the apostles could transmit this ability to certain other people to help them spread the gospel. However, the people that the apostles transmitted the power to work miracles to could not themselves transmit the ability to work miracles. So, after the last apostle died, there was no one who could transmit the ability to work miracles. And after the last person who had such an ability transferred to him by an apostle died, the age of miracles ceased. And from there, they also have an explanation for why God would do it this way. It's because the miracles were there to establish the church early on before the text of the New Testament were completed. But once the New Testament texts were completed, we had that which was perfect. We no longer needed miracles for confirmation about which books were valid and what the church would teach. We now have the New Testament. And I had always had a problem with this logic, because it's not like the first time miracles happened in the Bible was during the ministry of Jesus. Miracles happened in the Old Testament, less frequently than the self-declared skeptic community thinks. They like presenting the Bible as fairy tales with magic, and they act like it's a miracle on every page, and they actually use that as an argument against the Bible, because they would say, miracles are so common in the Bible, how come we don't see them today? In reality, miracles were not common in the Bible. It's also a bizarre question to ask someone from the Churches of Christ, because they would actually tell you the age of miracles is over, but atheists today typically don't process the fact that Christians actually have different beliefs. They will often use the idea that Christians have different beliefs to discredit the religion, because if God existed, why couldn't he just guide all of the Christians to truth like you believe? You believe you have an indwelling of the Holy Spirit that leads you to all truth, so why is it that Christians disagree? And they don't really want Christians to answer that question. Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry for talking oddly in certain parts. It's this channel was put under unusually high degrees of scrutiny for 2 or 3 years, and eventually I was not allowed to load new videos onto it. The channel was locked. That lasted for 7 months. So I've fallen into this habit, but I don't necessarily think I need all of these habits any longer. But I talk in a funny way to help fool the intelligence synthetica, which is actually what targeted me. But I apologize I shouldn't do that now. I don't think I need to, but nevertheless, the point is, the skeptic community will talk about how there are 40,000 denominations of Christianity and how Christianity is actually Christianity, it's plural, it's multiple religions, and Christians don't agree. But then they'll make arguments that contradict this by acting as if all Christians agree with everything. They have no concept of Christians disagreeing on certain issues, unless it's something like a broad category, and even then they don't understand what's actually being taught by them. For instance, they know Catholics and Protestants disagree because Protestants think you're saved by belief without evidence in the stories of the Bible alone, whilst Catholics think you're saved by belief without evidence in the stories of the Bible plus good works. That's, of course, not really what the debate is about, but it is how they conceptualize salvation by faith alone, the Protestant belief, from the Catholic belief, which they think is salvation by faith plus works. And the atheist community defines faith, when we talk about religion, as belief without evidence, and assume that's what Martin Luther defined it as, and assume that's what the Catholic Church defines it as. And if Christians say that's not what faith means, they're being dishonest, and you should force them to use the religious definition of faith. And they even point to Hebrews 11:1 as the biblical definition of faith, and claim that proves their point, when it really doesn't, because Hebrews 11:1 isn't the biblical definition of faith. It's simply part of a longer discussion on faith, and ultimately Hebrews 11:1 says faith is evidence. It does not say faith is belief without evidence. It says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It does not say faith is believing something even though you have no evidence. It's rather not saying the same thing they're claiming at all, and ultimately Hebrews 11:1 is part of a motivational speech about being assured of our salvation if we stay the course with Christ, and it's telling us that we can see the end results now, even before they've come, and it's told in a motivational way. And it's not saying that we should believe things with no evidence. But that brings us back to the churches of Christ. I've actually had discussions with atheists about that, pointing out that I grew up in a church that believes there are no modern miracles, and they just keep repeating, why aren't there miracles? Like there are in the Bible. The Bible had miracles all the time, every day. How come you don't have them today? As if that's a problem for the churches of Christ. A few of them accused the churches of Christ of a cop-out. Most of them just ignored what I said. But therein lies the point. The churches of Christ are not a well-understood church. They just aren't. They aren't even very well understood by other Christians who often talk about them and have criticisms of them. And I don't really think that it's unfair to criticize certain beliefs that the Church of Christ have. I myself criticize them. As I said, I don't really believe the argument that miracles stopped, because even though it is a logical argument that Jesus gave the apostles the ability to work miracles and to transmit the ability to work miracles, but those they transmitted it to could not transmit it, and that these signs were there only until that which is perfect came, I understand that. But the assumption that it carries is that miracles can only be worked through human agents, and that God cannot bestow the ability to work miracles on human agents directly. It must only come through this line of Jesus that ended after the death of the last apostles and the people that they had transmitted the gifts to. And I don't see that as quite as sound as the churches of Christ typically do, because Moses worked miracles, and Moses lived well before Jesus. He did not get this ability from Jesus. And we had various prophets in the Old Testament that were able to perform miracles, although in reality, theologically speaking, no prophet has ever worked a miracle. Not even the apostles really do. Rather, God works the miracles through them, which is an important distinction that most people don't make. And I just don't think that God can't simply bestow this gift upon people today if he so desired, nor do I think that an actual human person needs to have this gift bestowed upon them for a miracle to occur. God can simply directly perform a miracle on his own without a human intermediary. But having said that, having pointed out a criticism that I have of the churches of Christ, I must also defend them. Not because I agree with them, not because I was raised in them, not for some sort of filial devotion, but because they are not understood very well. Because people will talk about them in sheer ignorance. I remember a couple of years ago listening to a Catholic who claimed to have done studies in the Churches of Christ to talk about them, but he got very basic things wrong. For instance, he pointed out that, unlike we Catholics, as he said, the Churches of Christ don't have priests, they have pastors. Well, this is half right. The Churches of Christ do not have priests, at least not in the sense the Catholic Church does. In reality, they teach a priesthood of all believers, but we're talking about a sacramental office. But where he was wrong is when he said that the Churches of Christ have pastors, like other Protestant denominations would, like Baptists would, for instance. And he actually went on about this, saying that he wanted to make certain that he got the Churches of Christ beliefs correctly, so he looked at actual Churches of Christ sources, including respected Church of Christ pastors. And he pointed to one, and I can't remember his name now, but he went to this, and it was from a school of preaching from the Churches of Christ, I believe, either that or a university run by the Churches of Christ, like Aberdeen. So it was a credible source for Churches of Christ information, but he kept referring to this man as pastor, whatever his name was, and he made a point of telling us that he listened to Church of Christ pastors to understand what they believe. And it really undermined his credibility to me, because he honestly was only half trying. He came front-loaded with a lot of assumptions about what the Protestant denomination known as the Churches of Christ believed and how they functioned, and he filtered everything through that lens to help him understand it as a shorthand. And it really prevents him from understanding what the Churches of Christ actually are. The Churches of, and this isn't the first time I've seen this happen. For instance, Jeffrey Dahmer, the infamous serial killer and cannibal, converted to Christianity in prison, and he did so at the behest of a Church of Christ minister. And What Do You Mean actually spoke to this minister, but he introduced him as a Church of Christ pastor. What Do You Mean might be a little more forgiving than the Catholic bloke that I mentioned earlier, which is why I'm outright stating it's What Do You Mean. I do remember the name of the Catholic who said that, but while I'm not afraid of mentioning his name because I'm not being too harsh on him, I'm not saying he's some evil, vile monster, I do intend on talking about the situation again in the future, and specifically mentioning his name. But for now, I don't really think it's necessary, and I don't want to give too false of an impression of him. However, with What Do You Mean, he did not claim, as the Catholic bloke did, that he had done a study into what the Churches of Christ believe. Rather, he simply reached out to interview the man who had helped convert Jeffrey Dahmer. As such, I'm a little more forgiving of him, because the other one said, I am going to try and steelman Church of Christ beliefs. I am going to look at what they actually believe. I'm going to listen to the most respected pastors in their church. And they don't have priests like we do. They have pastors. And he made a lot of other basic assumptional errors about the Churches of Christ within his video. Whereas what do you mean just wanted to interview someone and probably just assumed that, like other Protestant denominations, they have a pastor, and thought that they were basically the same. Maybe they have a few different beliefs here or there, maybe they're pre-trib rapture or something, and he didn't really think about it. As a result, even though it irritated me to hear things like, Pastor Jim, especially seeing it in the comments section, it's more forgiving because it was an interview with a man whose beliefs you did not understand fully and weren't actually trying to. They were talking about what it was like to be with Jeffrey Dahmer than someone trying to explain and perhaps critique the Churches of Christ as an institution. But the Churches of Christ don't have pastors. And this is important because even though people in the modern skeptic community, they call themselves skeptics when they're not, it's really pseudo-skepticism, will say that it doesn't really matter if you call someone a priest or a pastor or a reverend, it's all just a job title. These words do have meaning, and they convey certain beliefs. And the reason it's wrong to talk about a Church of Christ pastor isn't simply because they don't use the title pastor. It's because they literally don't have pastors. You see, a pastor is understood as someone who has spiritual authority and who leads a congregation. There is a difference between how the Catholic Church understands a pastor and how the Protestants understand a pastor. Because especially after Vatican II, it is permitted to refer to a Catholic priest as pastor. But both of them agree that a given group, be it called a parish or a congregation or community or what have you, is led by a single man who has spiritual authority over that group, to whom the other people who are members are answerable to. A pastor is therefore a spiritual authority who runs the actual congregation, who runs the actual day-to-day business of the church, who is in charge of the church. Even if there's something else like a council that can balance out his power, he's the one that's in charge, rather like a president or a governor or a manager. He is the one that's in charge. Perhaps he doesn't have unlimited power, but he's the one that's in charge, and ultimately, members of that congregation must defer to him, respecting his position and submitting themselves to his authority. And that is why the Churches of Christ don't have pastors, because even though they do have men who preach on Sundays, those men are referred to as preachers, not pastors. And again, it's more than just having a different title. A preacher does not have unique authority over individuals within the congregation. And in fact, the preacher does not run the congregation. And I don't just mean that the preacher is the man that's vaguely in charge, but they also have this other group of elders that have co-equal authority, and he sits with the elders, but is the one that's like a CEO, where they can outvote him collectively, but he is still individually in charge. That's not how the Churches of Christ work. Rather, the Churches of Christ are run by a body of elders. This group collectively decides everything that happens within church business. They determine the treasury and how to spend money, and they need to buy new land, and duties for cleaning the church, and various different things. If the church decides to run Vacation Bible School, for instance, that's who decides it. The preacher may or may not be a member of this group, which is important as a distinction, because if the preacher is in fact a member of the elders, he doesn't sit at the head of the table like some sort of CEO with greater authority than the other members. He's just a regular elder. And sometimes the preacher is not an elder and has no authority outside of his position of preaching. Granted, for practical reasons, most of the time, Churches of Christ do allow the preacher to do more than just preach sermons. Often the preacher is also expected to visit the sick or the homebound, to give communion to people who could not show up, and to do other various tasks that typically we would associate with a pastor beyond just preaching. But notably, the preacher rarely is the one that serves at the altar to give out communion, which in the Churches of Christ is done every week. And also notably, the preacher going to visit the sick or the homebound, or doing other things outside of the church, outside of the function of preaching, is again something the elders ask him to do, or something he volunteers to do, and which makes sense because he is the visible face if you go into a various congregation, because he's the one that preaches. But it is not because he is in charge and has some sort of authority to do so. Rather, it is simply the most convenient solution, because a group of men can't do all of that together collectively. Especially if the group of elders has other jobs throughout the week and they can't just all perform these duties. However, the Churches of Christ do not have an ordination process. You do not go from a layman who isn't allowed to preach to being ordained a preacher and thus being imbued with some sort of authority to preach. Rather, any baptized man within the Churches of Christ can preach the sermon. Normally, the duties fall upon one man who is chosen to be the preacher. Quite often, that man is actually paid to be the preacher. Sometimes the congregation is wealthy enough or large enough. Usually large enough is also wealthy enough. He can do this full time. He can even take a staff position in the church and go to work effectively 7 days a week, where he would answer the phone or talk to people in a counseling, which again, very much does look like what a pastor would do. But it is a crucial distinction to note that he's not doing that because he has been ordained a preacher and has authority. Rather, it is simply a convenient way of handling the situation, because someone having a spiritual crisis will need someone to talk to who is within the Churches of Christ if they are themselves members, and you can't always have the elders do that. It is convenient to have him there, but he does not have a special authority, derived from ordination, which sets him apart from the rest of the congregation, and he does not have any special authority over the congregation. He is simply someone that we are trusting to help guide us in this situation, because he is available to do that job. But it is a job that the elders gave him and that he can be discharged from by the elders. And again, the preacher need not himself be an elder, so he sometimes, if he is not an elder, cannot even decide church business. He has no real voice in it, unless he himself is also an elder, in which case he gets the same vote as the other elders. And therein lies the point. The Churches of Christ don't really function like the other Protestant denominations. In fact, even though it is usually referred to as a Protestant denomination, the Churches of Christ are not Protestant. And that's because the word Protestant doesn't just mean to protest. This is one problem that I have with the modern Catholic talking points. For instance, recently the SSPX was excommunicated. Not just the bishops that were consecrated and those who consecrated them, but all the priests and even the laity who attend their services. And keep in mind, the SSPX is a clerical fraternity, meaning that in order to be a member of the SSPX, you must be clergy. There is no such thing as a layman who is a member of the SSPX. Rather, who is being excommunicated are people who attend SSPX masses, which people think is rather draconian of Pope Leo. But it's worse than the 1988 consecration. And I agree. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because that's not really how the Churches of Christ function. The Churches of Christ have this same problem that I see emerging from certain Catholic circles. And that is, they are called Protestants. And the reason I bring up the SSPX is because the SSPX, according to some Catholic commentators, is now a Protestant denomination. That, of course, makes no sense, but it is being called that. And they'll point to the fact that Protestants comes from the word to protest, and they are protesting something about Rome. If you protest, you're a Protestant. Oddly enough, they don't apply this typically to the Eastern Orthodox. I have seen some people actually call the Eastern Orthodox Protestants, but it is rare. It seems that Protestant is for any group that protests Rome that happened to emerge after the 1500s, after the Protestant Reformation. The problem with this is that it fixates too much on the root of the word Protestant itself, rather than what the word has actually come to mean, or what it meant in the 1500s. The word Protestant doesn't just mean to protest any longer, it means having a certain specific belief system. And that certain specific belief system precludes the SSPX, or for that matter, Old Catholics. You see, to be a Protestant, you must believe in the 5 solas, or at the very least, you must believe in the 2 pillar foundations. And those 2 pillar foundations are the single most important thing that define Protestantism. The 5 solas are, of course, that the Bible is the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice, that one is saved by faith alone, that one is saved through grace alone, that Christ alone is the one who saves us, and that all is done for the glory of God alone. Oddly enough, the last 2 of the 5 solas are something that Catholics actually agree with. So I really don't like using the 5 solas as a basis for understanding what a Protestant is, precisely because there is such an overlap. But that does leave the other 3, that the Bible is the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice, that salvation is by faith alone, and that salvation is by grace alone. And ultimately, only the first 2 truly define Protestantism. Because without the first 2, you really can't have the third one, especially without the second one. And that is that the Bible is the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice, and that our salvation is through faith alone. This is why, when I listen to modern Catholic groups refer to the SSPX as a new Protestant denomination because they're protesting Rome, it is absurd. Calling them Protestants means that you're saying they believe the Bible is the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice, which they clearly don't. And you're saying that they believe that salvation is by faith alone, which they clearly don't believe. So the SSPX, whatever else you may think of them, are not Protestant. It doesn't matter if they're protesting Rome or not, because the word Protestant means something beyond just protesting Rome. And that brings us back to the Churches of Christ, because as bizarre as this may sound to people who are unfamiliar with their beliefs, the Churches of Christ are not Protestants. Now, you may say, but that doesn't make any sense. Of course, they're Protestant. I've even seen them listed as Protestant denominations. They came after the 1500s. But ask yourself, what does the Church of Christ actually teach? And of course, if you call them Protestant, what does that mean that they teach? What do you think of when you hear about them as a Protestant denomination? Well, of course, you believe that they hold that the Bible is the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice, and that the Churches of Christ believe that one is saved by faith alone. And therein lies the problem. Because the Churches of Christ do believe the first of those 2. The Churches of Christ do believe that the Bible is the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice. Thus, you have one of the 2 pillars of Protestantism that is affirmed by the Churches of Christ. But, as I said, you need 2 pillars, not just 1. So, do the Churches of Christ believe that we are saved by faith alone? And keep in mind, I am not attacking the Churches of Christ from the outside. many people would actually agree that they don't teach that, because the Churches of Christ rather famously believe that baptism is essential to salvation, that one must be baptized. And a lot of Protestants who believe in salvation by faith alone would say that if you teach that baptism is necessary for salvation, then you are teaching a works-based salvation. And that would discredit you. However, we're not asking what other Protestant groups would say, we're asking what the Churches of Christ internally teach. And belief in baptismal regeneration is not something that is uncommon within Protestantism. Many Protestants believe baptism is necessary. Traditionally, Anglicans believe this, although Anglicans are a bit of an oddity because they are both Catholic and Reformed. However, even Martin Luther, the founder of the Protestant movement, actually believed in baptismal regeneration. Lutherans to this day believe in that doctrine that baptism is necessary. And so do several other mainline and traditional Protestants, especially the older variety. So it's not an easy matter of, if you believe that salvation is by faith alone, then you cannot believe baptism is necessary for salvation. Martin Luther very obviously believed that salvation was by faith alone. He is the man who formulated that theology, or rediscovered it if you want to play with Protestant historical ideas. But he still nevertheless believed that baptism was necessary for salvation. Martin Luther never understood baptism as a work. He understood it as an act of faith, and there is a distinction. However, the question becomes, what does the Church of Christ actually teach about salvation? Do the Churches of Christ say that we are saved by faith alone? And the answer to that question is no, they don't. They'll even point to James chapter 2, just like Catholics will, and say that the only place that faith alone is found in the Bible is telling you that salvation is not by faith alone. The Churches of Christ believe that salvation is actually a process which places their theology closer to Catholic theology than to traditional Protestant theology or to Protestant theology in general, including Martin Luther's. They believe that salvation begins by hearing the word of God, realizing that you're a sinner, repenting of your sins, confessing them and confessing that Christ is the Lord, being baptized for the remission of your sins, and living faithfully thereafter. The Churches of Christ do not hold, as Calvinists do, for instance, or certain other Protestant groups, that one's salvation is a one-and-done thing. They do not believe that once you get saved, you are always saved. Indeed, the Churches of Christ do not believe that you get saved, which is one of the most annoying things I keep hearing from people, because they think that the Churches of Christ teach you get saved at baptism, as if the Churches of Christ believe, as evangelicals do, that you go from a state of being an unsaved sinner to being saved, and there's a specific moment where you got saved, with the evangelicals tracing that moment to the precise time that they prayed the sinner's prayer and invited Jesus into their heart, and at that moment they got saved. You can even write the date down on the back of a card. Sometimes they do pamphlets that do that, and they think the Churches of Christ have a similar mentality, only instead of tracing the moment where they get saved to the moment where they pray the sinner's prayer to invite Jesus into their heart, the Church of Christ would fill out that same card of when they got saved to the moment when they get baptized. And as soon as they are baptized and emerge from the waters of baptism, they are saved Christians. And that simply is not how the Churches of Christ actually conceptualize salvation. They do not think that you are saved at baptism. They do not think that there is a single moment where you get saved. No one in the Churches of Christ talk about getting saved in the way that an evangelical would, even though many sources online call the Churches of Christ an evangelical Protestant group, and they're simply not. They didn't even grow out of evangelicalism except in the most abstract way, and their theology is very distinct. Rather, the Churches of Christ understand salvation as a process that one goes through throughout one's life that is reciprocal, meaning that it is not simply God coming to you, you have to go also to God, and you cooperate with his grace, which aligns closer to the Catholic understanding than the Protestant understanding, and that you must live faithfully. And granted, there are Protestant groups who think you can lose your salvation, or that lifelong devotion would still be necessary, but the difference is that within Protestantism, there is still an understanding that God's grace alone saves you, that you do not actually cooperate in that grace, which is something that is specifically rejected by the Churches of Christ. It is also specifically rejected by Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And therein lies the point. The Churches of Christ do not have a similar view of salvation that Protestants have, and in fact reject the very foundational tenet of Protestantism, that one is saved by faith alone. But they do oddly adhere to the other great pillar of Protestantism, that the Bible is the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice. Which brings up another odd misunderstanding about the Churches of Christ. People learn rather early on that the Churches of Christ are congregational. They do not have a central denominational headquarters, and that's because they are not a denomination. The question of why they're not a denomination is something that people have lost track of, and I've even read Church of Christ literature that gets wrong why the Churches of Christ are not a denomination. Many people in the Churches of Christ, for instance, will confidently tell you that we are not a denomination because we have no central authority or president or office that regulates us. That's not what makes them not a denomination. If it did, then various Baptist groups wouldn't be a denomination either, and yet they could call themselves that. For instance, I can't remember what it is, but I think it's the First Baptists do not have a central authority. And they operate on the same congregational model. The Congregationalists do the same thing, and yet they are referred to as a denomination. The reason the Churches of Christ are not a denomination, though, and why they started saying we are not a denomination, goes back to the 19th century Restoration movement. Keep in mind, the Churches of Christ as a distinct group goes back to 1906, but it does originate with a broader Restoration movement. And the Restoration movement got started by rejecting all man-made creeds and denominational labels to being just Christians. And here is why they're not a denomination. It's actually the same reason that the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church are not denominations. And by the way, me saying that the Catholic Church and Orthodox Church are not denominations is not me saying they are not truly Christian. I don't know why, but whenever I bring up this point that the Churches of Christ, the Catholic Church, and the Eastern Orthodox Church are not denominations, people think I'm saying they're not Christian. That's not the point. The point is what the term denomination actually means within the context of Christianity, and, of course, the way that the word began to be used within Christianity. You see, prior to the Protestant Reformation, Christians had uniformly understood the church as a single entity and as the kingdom of Christ on earth. This is before dispensationalism or other theories that posited that the kingdom of Christ would be built when Christ returned a second time. The kingdom has already been established, and it is the church, and it is a united whole and indivisible. Furthermore, everyone recited the creeds, and the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed and the Athanasian Creed all agree that there is one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. At the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, the idea was not to separate from Rome and found new churches. The actual goal was to reform the teaching within the church. However, that obviously didn't happen, and the Protestant movement split off from Catholicism and fragmented into different traditions. This, however, caused a bit of a problem within Christianity, because various Protestant groups still recognized other Protestant groups, even if they were not administratively the same, or even if they taught slightly different things, as fellow Christians. Some even still retained the belief that Catholics were still Christians, even if they were mistaken, although it was much more common to view the Catholic Church as Antichrist and the Pope as Antichrist and as opposed to Christ. However, they didn't want to condemn other Protestants, but had serious theological or administrative differences between them. So how do you resolve this? For you see, if there is but one church, which one is the one church? Rather than resolving it cleanly by simply declaring their specific church is the true church and others are false, which is the oversimplistic caricature that many pseudo-skeptics in the self-declared skeptic community would claim churches to this day follow, they rather came up with this idea that the true church is a transcendent order, and each church that was started, be it the Lutheran Church or the Reformed Church founded by Calvin, or the Zwinglian Free Church, or whatever other group it was, the Waldenses, for instance, or the Packards, or the Free Church movement that's outside of Zwingli. Didn't really matter. It didn't. They were all Christians, and they were all part of the same overall church. The church began to be understood as the invisible body of all believers who are saved in Jesus Christ, and that became the defining qualification. With each thing that we are calling a church, like the Lutheran Church or the Reformed Church or the Church of England, not being actual separate churches, but rather being branches of the same church. To the early Protestant mind, the idea is that the fundamental roots of Christianity go back to God himself, who of course sent Christ and the Holy Spirit, and from there the church grew, with the true church being the trunk of the tree growing from the roots of that Trinity, and of course the life of Christ himself. But, over time, a tree sprouts branches, and each of those branches would be what we see today as the visible institutions that call themselves churches. And this is called the branch model, which is how early Protestants, and many Protestants today, still view it. For instance, a rather popular YouTuber, Redeemed Zoomer, holds to the branch model, as do various other respected figures in modern Christianity, such as the Reverend Brett Murphy, who sees the Anglicans as a branch, and his own form of Anglicans, I think he has Free Church of England, as a branch of a branch, whereas Anglican Church broke off, and then others broke off a bit, but they're all connected. This model allowed them to understand that there is fundamentally one church, because there is one tree. But each of the new churches that started are a branch of that tree, with the Catholic Church being a poisonous branch that needed to be hewn off, but the others sprouting in its place. And that is where the concept of denominations came from, and they started calling them denominations, rather like how money has denominations. For instance, you can have a $1 bill, a $2 bill, a $5 bill, a $10 bill, a $20 bill, a $50 bill, or a $100 bill. And historically, in the US, you could also have a $1,000 bill, or $5,000 bill, or even a $10,000 bill. But those have been discontinued and were even rare back in the past. Nevertheless, each one of those was legal US tender, but they represented different amounts. This was similar to how churches were being understood, although when it came to churches, it was less that each one had a different value assigned to it, but rather they were still operating under the idea of not only is there one church, but the church is the kingdom of Christ on earth. Indeed, none of the Protestant reformers of the Reformation age actually held the idea of Christ returning to build a kingdom later, they all understood the church as the kingdom. That is why, like the Catholic Church, they all ran church courts and all decided that the church was largely self-regulatory and how it ran. The church is largely an embassy for Christ on earth. To them, then, they started viewing the kingdom of Christ as divided into different provinces, and each province was able to have its own local laws and its own local customs, but they were all still part of the same larger kingdom. As such, they were able to conceptualize each different church as being equally Christian, with the possible exception of Catholicism, which was often condemned as corrupt and false and all that, but still ultimately united and connected to the same central law and the same central authority under the same central king. And that is where the concept of denominationalism came from. And of course, it endures to this day. But that is why the Catholic Church is not a denomination, and also why Eastern Orthodoxy is not really a denomination either, and why the Churches of Christ are not a denomination. It isn't because they're not Christian. It is because they are fundamentally isolated from the others. The Catholic Church, for instance, doesn't even recognize most Protestant churches as churches, but rather refers to them as ecclesiastical communities. This is because, according to the Catholic Church, one must have a formal structure of bishops and priests and deacons in order to be a proper functioning church. And even then, there are caveats, because the Catholic Church, for instance, rather famously declared Anglican orders invalid. But it never quite resolved whether or not the Anglicans could still be called a church or not, because the Anglicans still at least have the form of having deacons, priests, and bishops. Some Catholic writers would say that the Anglicans are an ecclesiastical community no different than other Protestant groups, because they don't really have bishops, because their orders are invalid, whilst others would argue that even though they have invalid orders and therefore no apostolic authority, they still have the structures of it and are therefore still a church, just one with no actual apostolic mandate. But that is neither here nor there. Rather, the point that I'm making is, the Catholic Church does not recognize itself as one church out of many. It does not recognize itself as a province within the kingdom of Christ, no greater or no lesser than others, running its own internal affairs, but co-equal with the others who are equally Christian and have equal authority. Rather, the Catholic Church claims that it is the one true church of Jesus Christ on earth, and the others are outside of it and should be brought in to submit to its authority and adapt its teachings to Catholic teachings. The Eastern Orthodox also have a similar view. The Eastern Orthodox do not view Protestant churches as co-equal churches within the broader kingdom of Christ, viewing their own church as simply one province out of many, with others being equally valid. They view themselves as the one church founded by Jesus Christ. Conversely, they do not recognize the legitimacy of Protestant churches, neither do the Catholic Church. Which brings us back to the Churches of Christ. They also do not view the Churches of Christ as only one church of many, and that the true church is this overall transcendent thing, and that the Church of Christ denomination is just one denomination out of several within the actual greater broader church, and that all the other churches are co-equal with it. Rather, the Churches of Christ are singular and distinct and do not recognize the legitimacy of other churches. That doesn't mean that they view the people in those churches as not Christian, but they do not recognize their legitimacy, and they do not recognize anything about their theology being correct or even equal. This is why, for instance, even though in recent times with the Catholic Church having been infiltrated by modernists, you are not supposed to see a Catholic priest concelebrating with anyone who is not Catholic. They have made exceptions officially for Eastern Orthodox, whom they view as both holding valid holy orders and having mostly the same beliefs. But for the most part, you don't really find Catholic clergy concelebrating with Lutherans or Anglicans, or at least you shouldn't. Some of the more liberal Catholics have done so in the past, but this is actually strictly a violation of canon law and of their theology, and strictly speaking, they are not supposed to do that. Conversely, you will never find an Eastern Orthodox church concelebrating with Anglicans or with Lutherans or with Sphygmonians or something like that. And you certainly won't have them concelebrating with a Baptist pastor or recognizing the Baptist pastor as co-equal to their own bishops. That just simply does not happen within Eastern Orthodoxy. And the same thing is true of the Churches of Christ. The Churches of Christ do not hold joint worship with other churches. They simply don't. They don't even hold joint events with other churches. The Churches of Christ stand alone and do not recognize other churches. You do not have a shared event between Churches of Christ and Baptists, for instance, or Churches of Christ and Methodists. You simply don't have that. And that is why the Churches of Christ are not a denomination, because they stand apart and alone and do not conceptualize themselves as just one province within the kingdom of Christ, with other churches being equal provinces. They recognize themselves as the Church of Jesus Christ, the Lord's Church, and everyone else as misguided and wrong. And therein lies why it is not a denomination. And that brings us to an interesting point, though. Because earlier I mentioned that not having a central headquarters or authority that unites them is not really why they're not a denomination. And it's true. There are plenty of Protestant denominations that function similarly to the Churches of Christ in that they run congregationally and there is no central hierarchy that would keep them all in line. But that is not what makes them not a denomination, as I said. However, what is interesting is that even though a lot of people don't know much about what the Churches of Christ actually believe, such as them being cessationists who believe that the age of miracles is over, people do know that the Churches of Christ are congregational. And from there, they engage in circular reasoning regarding the Churches of Christ, which I find rather unfair. You see, they'll start with the assumption that because each Church of Christ operates autonomously from all the other Churches of Christ and there is no central authority who can intervene and correct doctrinal teachings, this must mean that each Church of Christ will start teaching whatever it feels like, and there will be a great deal of variety depending upon which congregation you go to. They will then explain why there is a good deal of diversity and why it's hard to talk about the Churches of Christ and what they believe, precisely because there are so many diverse beliefs within the Churches of Christ, by pointing out that this diversity of beliefs that makes it hard to pinpoint exactly what the Church of Christ believes is because they have a congregational model, and each local congregation decides its own beliefs, with many of them going back to saying that the pastor of the congregation decides what is taught because they assume that the Church of Christ, like other Protestant denominations, have a pastor. But like the fact that the Churches of Christ don't actually have pastors, and like the fact that they are not actually Protestant, and like the fact that they are not actually a denomination, the idea that because each congregation is autonomous and self-governing, this must mean that each congregation comes up with its own beliefs and that you never quite know what you're going to get if you walk into a Church of Christ because each congregation teaches something different is not really true. Rather, The Churches of Christ have a remarkably consistent, uniform theology across the board, which may sound bizarre, because if you do not have a central headquarters that puts everyone in line and controls what people are teaching, then surely you're going to have different congregations drift. You can just have someone set up a Church of Christ and teach whatever they want. Obviously, you're going to have radical differences between one Church of Christ and another, even if they're in the same town, because whoever is in charge of one Church of Christ is not in charge of another one. Indeed, this is often used to prove wrong what I have said about the Churches of Christ already. For instance, I point out that the Churches of Christ do not have pastors. Well, that might be true of the congregation I went to, but other Churches of Christ do. They have pastors in some congregations and no pastors in others. But is that really true? And of course it's not. And this last point is very important, because people do know that the Churches of Christ teach that baptism is necessary for salvation. People do know that, and they criticize it by pointing out, well, what if someone came to Jesus but died before they had a chance to be baptized? According to you, they're damned to hell just because they didn't get water. And they don't really think about there being any sort of exemplary reason behind it. Nor do they think that even if this is what they believe, there might be an honest conviction behind it. It's just the Church of Christ belief is unfair because you might die before baptism and then you go to hell. They rather just dismiss it because it is unfair, much like the atheists dismiss things for being unfair, whether or not they're properly representing them. They know the Churches of Christ teach baptismal regeneration. And for the most part, they know it does not play musical instruments, that you sing a cappella music. But this last one is something that's a bit bizarre, because I've actually heard some people say, well, there are some Church of Christ congregations that play musical instruments while others don't. It's one of those things that they don't agree on. But one of the things that I've noticed is that there are a handful of things that are associated with the Churches of Christ that people will criticize, and the rest will be, well, we can't really tell you what they believe because they're congregational. One congregation's pastor will teach one thing, and another congregation's pastor will teach another, because, again, they operate on the assumption that the Churches of Christ have pastors. Or at the very least, they'll say, one congregation teaches one thing and another teaches another. It's impossible to talk about Church of Christ beliefs, because it's a congregational church, and they don't all agree, and that simply isn't the case. But what's even more bizarre about this is that I will tell people that I grew up within the Churches of Christ. I have intimate knowledge of how the Churches of Christ work, and I have studied the teachings of my own church. I didn't just go there and attend and come home. I listened, I paid attention, and I read books on the Churches of Christ at home. I know exactly what the Churches of Christ actually teach, and they act as if I'm a lunatic or a moron who has only ever attended one congregation in the Churches of Christ and just assume all the other congregations are like the one that I attended, and that I don't know what I'm talking about, and it's just a self-evident fact that because the Churches of Christ are congregational, that means that each congregation teaches different things, and they can be wildly divergent, and you can't discuss the Churches of Christ in terms of their theology and what they believe, because they don't have a central belief system. They have a diverse things that just have nothing in common with each other but its name, Church of Christ, on the door. And it doesn't really matter what I tell people or my experiences. They just assume that I'm assuming that the one congregation that I went to is an exemplar of all of them, without realizing the broad diversity that actually exists. Without, of course, bothering to prove that such a diversity actually does exist. Rather, it is just assumed that because the Churches of Christ are congregational and autonomous, they must have diverse beliefs. And then we explain their diverse beliefs by the congregationalism, thus the circular nature of the objection. In reality, of course, I grew up in the Churches of Christ, and that means that I attended more than one congregation in my life. I have visited congregations in other states and even other countries besides America. I have actually attended regular services in multiple Churches of Christ, depending on what stage of life I'm in, and I have never encountered a situation where I attended one Church of Christ for years and it taught one specific set of beliefs, and then I attended another one and it taught something radically different. every Church of Christ I have ever attended believes in exactly the same things. Every single one. And I have attended, and keep in mind, when I say I have attended, I'm not just referring to ones that I belonged to and were in regularly. I'm talking about even when I would travel, and this was before the plague hit, the one that Anthony Fauci is being so honest about in Congress with his bleeding the fifth lately. 111 times bleeding the fifth, in fact. Rather, I have attended about, or perhaps a little over, 100 congregations. I was not a member of over 100 congregations, of course, but I used to travel to Los Angeles for business purposes. I have been to other states, to other countries. I have been places. And I've even traveled within Tennessee, where I live, and have visited other churches, either because I am not in town and it would be impractical for me to go to the one I would normally go to, or because I was simply invited to go to another one. I have been to Churches of Christ in many cities within Tennessee. I have been to Churches of Christ in Kentucky. I have been to Churches of Christ in Georgia. I have been to Churches of Christ in Florida. I have been to Churches of Christ in Alabama. I have been to Churches of Christ in New York. New York State, in fact, specifically New York City. I have been to Churches of Christ in Louisiana. I have been to Churches of Christ in California. I have been to Churches of Christ in England, and they are all alike in what they teach. Many of them I visited only once, so you may rightly point out that I perhaps did not stay with them long enough to have a true representative sense of what they taught. But many of them I visited several times, or even attended regularly, weekly. And I can guarantee you, from all of that, and from reading materials from the Churches of Christ, for instance, you can watch the International Gospel Hour, you can listen to it on the radio or watch it on television, and they even present a Bible study course that you can get from the Mount Leo Church of Christ. And they are themselves not produced by the Mount Leo Church of Christ. They're presented by a church, I believe, in West Virginia. Whilst the Mount Leo Church of Christ is in Tennessee. You can watch Ben Bailey. He does a television show that is called The Gospel of Christ. And I believe both the International Gospel Hour and the Gospel of Christ can be found online. You can find other Churches of Christ programs that are aired on television or on radio or even on the internet. And they all teach the same things. You can go to Church of Christ tents at various county fairs and events. You can order Church of Christ books, and they are all very uniform in what they teach. This idea that because the Churches of Christ are congregational in nature, then you can't really pinpoint what they believe because each congregation believes something different, is simply an assumption that functions by presuming that if a congregation is autonomous, then it must come up with its own theology, and therefore the beliefs will be different. And that simply isn't the case. While it is true that the Churches of Christ run autonomous congregations, what is not true is that they are wholly disconnected from other Churches of Christ. And the Churches of Christ have always been united by a shared literary tradition and a shared theological perspective. And this last one is the one that people would assume would be creeping with each new Church of Christ that someone just decided to open. But they're not like the Baptists in this regard. Modern Baptists are notorious for being able to have someone decide one day that he's not just Bob, he's Pastor Bob, and opening up a Baptist church. That's not how the Churches of Christ operate. The churches of Christ operate by planting new churches, recognizing each other, and they recognize each other based upon the shared beliefs and the shared traditions. And the churches of Christ are not an emotion-based church. They are very logical, they are very rational, and they are very studious. You do not go to a Church of Christ expecting to hear rock music, and you don't go to a Church of Christ expecting a Pentecostal style dancing and waving of arms and feeling the Holy Spirit. Rather, the Church of Christ teaches that the Holy Spirit is simply the knowledge of Christ and knowledge of what we're supposed to do in God's will as we get from the Bible and through church teaching. So there is no special indwelling of the Spirit in some supernatural way within the churches of Christ, but there is an emphasis on logic and on conformity to a handed-down tradition. None of it is experiential, and none of it focuses on your feelings or what you would think of as your own. And as such, the churches of Christ are able to actually focus on what the church teaches as their primary focus, rather than on how it makes you feel or on what you think. This is why the churches of Christ don't have members that give their testimony. And keep in mind, I'm not talking in a vague sense. Obviously, there are people in the churches of Christ that tell various stories about their life, about why they believe what they believe, or if they are converts to the churches of Christ, why they converted, or if they were born into it but drifted away, how they came back. But this isn't handled in the same way that an evangelical testimony is. They don't invite people to go up to the altar and give their testimony. That's not how the churches of Christ actually operate. And that's why I find it rather disingenuous when I tell people that the churches of Christ don't really give their testimonies, only for them to dig up some article written by someone in the churches of Christ, which explains why they're a member of the churches of Christ. Obviously, people aren't going to tell you why they joined or why they belong to a group or what they agree with, but it's not quite the same as an evangelical's testimony that we're all used to, where someone gets up and says, "Oh, was a sinner. Oh, was into drink and women and gambling. Oh, was a wreck and I was hurting people. And then I sold the light and I prayed to Jesus and he entered my heart. Hallelujah, I got saved." It's not that sort of thing. Everyone has a testimony if you loosen the definition of testimony to anything that someone says about their own life or their own beliefs. But that is clearly not what's being described when we talk about testimony in this context. And therein lies the point. Whereas something like an evangelical church or a Baptist church or a Pentecostal church will focus heavily on the personal experiences that one has, on one's personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And while they don't necessarily see theology as unimportant, will still make it secondary to that experiential nature, which itself is key to when you became a Christian, since they have a clear delineated time period to a time before when you are an unsaved sinner, to a time when you got saved at a very specific point in time and thereafter are a saved Christian. The conversion moment itself is rooted in a heavily expectant emotional moment, an expectation that you had an emotional epiphany at that time, a specific point in history, when you came to Christ, when you prayed the sinner's prayer, when you invited him into your heart, and when you had a personal relationship with him. After that, after coming to Christ, after having a personal relationship with him, after admitting you're a sinner, after being cleansed and being saved, is when you think about the finer nuanced detail. And even then, the primary focus is on one's own personal relationship, and that is what allows the deviations to occur, because theology is largely de-emphasized within evangelical or Pentecostal traditions in favor of both being largely more inclusive of various people of different denominations and upon the interiority of one's personal perspective and personal relationship. The churches of Christ differ from this sharply in that they don't actually concern themselves with your personal experiences, at least in terms of what is and is not true. Your personal experiences are, of course, important, as are your feelings, but at the end of the day, what matters is what is and is not true, and we determine that by using reason and by turning to the scriptures, which are largely external to you. So, the churches of Christ are able to perpetuate a consistent theology precisely because they have a shared body of literature that codifies what that theology is, even without formalizing it as official church teaching and even without having creeds. Because it is picked up within the community, and the community is told, this is true, this is what has been handed to you, and ultimately, while you matter as a person, as do your feelings in your personal life, what is ultimately important is this that we are handing to you, that was true before you became a Christian and will be true after you're dead. It will be true if you leave. It will be true if you disagree. This is what is true. And ultimately, the churches of Christ have been able to remain remarkably consistent and uniform in their beliefs precisely because of this rather studious academic approach to their faith, which evangelicals and Pentecostals simply don't have, which modern Baptists often don't have. And the assumption that because they have no central authority to keep them all in line, they must all start deviating, automatically assumes that each one is simply opening the Bible and interpreting it for the first time themselves based upon their own feelings, which is the very thing that the Churches of Christ actually de-emphasize and tell you should not do. You should never interpret the Bible based upon your own feelings and experiences. You should instead try and understand what it is actually saying, and luckily people have come before you. You can read their wisdom. While this never quite reaches the level of church fathers being venerated by Catholics, it is still nevertheless the same in function. Your beliefs are directed to conform to the consensus view that has built up since the 19th century. You are not simply free to come up with your own interpretation as a Church of Christ pastor. You can't just build a Church of Christ, put the name Church of Christ on there, and start preaching and be accepted by others in the Church of Christ as a Church of Christ. And if you start teaching things that are outside of that agreed to consensus that is reinforced through repeated literature and other things like television programs nowadays, then you are simply not considered really part of the Churches of Christ. Of course, to mug things up, there are groups that started with the Churches of Christ that were disfellowshipped, some of which still use the term Church of Christ in their name, although most of them do at least alter the name to some extent. For instance, the International Churches of Christ, or the Churches of Christ Worldwide. Both of these that I just mentioned, and several others, do teach things that are very different than the actual Churches of Christ that we're talking about, and some of them do indeed have pastors. Whether or not they are formally ordained or not is irrelevant. But we're not talking about those groups. They are offshoots, and it's rather unfair to do so, because unless you are going to compare them and see what they kept and what they changed, trying to determine what the Churches of Christ actually do and are based upon an offshoot, and trying to say that the offshoot proves me wrong, is rather silly. But it's something that I encounter often. Someone will point to one of these offshoots. Sometimes innocently, they actually think this offshoot is a Church of Christ, but often they'll know it's an offshoot, but they'll say, but it still came from the Churches of Christ, thus it proves my point. The Congregational model allows for this disagreement. That's why they can believe this. And it's rather silly, because the reason they split off from the Churches of Christ is because they differ from the Churches of Christ. You can't use a group that splintered off the Churches of Christ to prove what the Churches of Christ believe, especially if that group splintered off the Churches of Christ because they disagreed with it. In fact, if anything, the groups that splintered off of the Churches of Christ because they disagreed with them proves the uniformity that I've been talking about, since if the Churches of Christ, by their very nature, have congregational model where each congregation teaches something different, and it can be wildly different depending on what congregation there are, then the Churches of Christ should have been able to absorb the differences within those other groups, rather than those other groups feeling the need to be separate. If the Churches of Christ operated as people generally say they do, where they disagree wildly between different congregations, why would one disagreeing lead to a separation, while another disagreeing not. The simple truth is the Churches of Christ have a uniform belief system. And if you disagree with it, they will disfellowship you. And if you're disfellowshipped, you generally don't keep the name Church of Christ, and if you do, you are largely condemned for it. This is why Max Lucado is no longer in the Churches of Christ. He started taking instrumental music and teaching various different things that the Churches of Christ disapproved of, and he was simply disfellowshipped, and he eventually honored that, by changing the name of his church, although, to be fair, he did keep the Church of Christ name for a while. But having said all that, the Churches of Christ are also misunderstood in another way, and this is something that I saw on a video by a professional atheist. And yes, I know, there's no such thing as a professional atheist. No one is going to pay you to just lack belief in a God. Well, atheism isn't just a lack of belief in a God, it is a belief that God does not exist. Atheists call people delusional for believing in God, and refer to God as people's imaginary friend, whilst calling God a fictional character. It is silly to say that they just lack belief, and ultimately, if you're going to get paid to be an atheist activist, then you have no right to claim that it is absurd to say someone is a professional atheist. And people like Matt Dillahunty or Aaron Rawl or Hamid Mehta are all paid good money to promote atheism. Saying that it's silly to call them professional atheists because no one's going to pay you to just lack belief is obviously not true. Having said that, there's this man called Owen Morgan who has a 666 tattooed on his arm, who used to be a Jehovah's Witness, and who runs a channel where he regularly condemns churches as being cults and goes down a cult list. A few years ago, he did a video series on the Church of... He did 2 or 3 videos on the Churches of Christ, and he exposed them as definitely being a cult, but he got everything wrong about them. For instance, he said that if you're a member of the Church of Christ, you're not allowed to be friends with anyone who is not in the Churches of Christ. This wasn't true. You are allowed to be friends with people who are not in the Churches of Christ. I believe he got this because most of his research comes from reading things like Wikipedia articles, putting the worst possible spin on a group, and then filtering it all through his condemnations of Jehovah's Witnesses. But the Churches of Christ aren't like the Jehovah's Witnesses. Being a member of the Churches of Christ does not require you to be isolated from society or to not participate, and you certainly can be friends with people who are not in the Churches of Christ. For instance, I once knew a woman who was a member of a Church of Christ, but she never attended with her husband, who was a member of some other church, and I even encountered the opposite, where a woman was a member of, I think, the International Church of Foursquare Gospel, but her husband was Church of Christ, and they attended on Sundays at different churches. If you can marry someone who is not in the Churches of Christ, then obviously you can be friends with them. Of course, some atheists try and say, well, maybe they got married before. They didn't, and that's not the point. I grew up in the Churches of Christ, and I was never told I could not be friends with someone who was not in the Churches of Christ. It's just absurd to say that. Just like it's absurd to say that they think it's a heinous sin to call someone a pastor. They don't think that. They think it's technically incorrect to call the preacher a pastor, because it is, but they don't think it's some sort of heinous sin. Of course, Owen Morgan depicted the Churches of Christ as discouraging higher education, which makes no sense because they run universities, and then he pointed that out, but then he said, they either tell you not to pursue higher education, or they only allow you to go to the schools that they run. That's false. They do run, of course, universities. Most churches do. There are universities that are affiliated with the Churches of Christ, but if you wish to pursue higher education, they do not discourage it, nor do they compel you to go only to a school affiliated with the church. Owen Morgan, of course, wanted to depict them as cult-like, so in addition to not being able to be friends with anyone outside the church, you are either not allowed to pursue higher education, or if you insist, you are only allowed to go to a Church of Christ school where you kept insulated within the cult and you are not allowed contact with the outside world, and that is simply not how the Churches of Christ operates. He, of course, ended his video with telling his audience that there was this shocking news, because he always does this. He always points out that historical churches supported slavery and racism, but he needed to brace his audience for the shock, because this fundamentalist cult that hates everyone and thinks they're all damned if they're not part of it, tells you, cuts you off from the world, tells you can't even be friends with people outside the church, and tells you not to educate yourself, or if you do, only do it through their schools. This cult, this fundamentalist cult that believes the Bible is literally true and rejects evolution for creationism, should obviously think slavery is okay, because the Bible is a thoroughly pro-slavery book, and because it teaches that slavery is okay, he should teach racism. But he braced his audience of atheists and told them they'd better prepare for this one. The Churches of Christ actually opposed slavery and was pro-abolition. Well, as much as you can be for a Congregational church. They had to put that in there, because obviously some congregations were opposed to slavery. We have records of that. But I'm sure others were pro-slavery. Because you know how the Church of Christ is. It's congregational. That means that one congregation can oppose slavery while another one is for it. There's no uniformity. And of course, there is. I just told you that. And Owen Morgan himself had to admit that, because he pointed that out himself while trying to mitigate it. But what's interesting is the other battle of mitigation. You see, he pointed out that the Churches of Christ opposed slavery. They even opposed segregation later, and they opposed all manner of racism. This was presented as shocking news, because the Churches of Christ were presented as a thoroughly unpleasant cult that sealed you off from the world, prevented you from higher education, or trying to control you if you insist by only sending you to their schools, being a science-denying church that was creationist and evolutionist, which of course is the highest form of evil for atheists, and of course believing everything the Bible says is literally true, therefore they must be pro-slave, but they're not. But and this would be confusing. This evil fundamentalist church, it would be so pleasant to point out that they were pro-slavery, that they supported the slave cause, that they were racist and saw blacks as inferior to whites, that they were pro-segregation, but they weren't. This fundamentalist church ignored part of the Bible that was pro-slavery and just rejected it. This is shocking. But don't worry, Owen Morgan still found a way of vilifying the Churches of Christ, even for their opposition to slavery and racism. You see, Owen Morgan explained that they didn't really oppose slavery, and they didn't actually oppose racism either. Clearly, the people running the church were fundamentalists. They clearly believed slavery was okay, and they obviously believed in racism. But if that was true, why would they oppose it publicly? Well, in addition to being a Congregationalist church where you can't really tell what they believe, you can only do this as far as we can see, but you know they're Congregationalists, they disagree. But he also pointed out something else. The Churches of Christ may have taken a stand against slavery and racism and segregation, but that doesn't mean they actually oppose slavery and racism and segregation. No. They only oppose those things to shift the hate to the outsider and the apostate. So thereby, Owen Morgan exposed the great evil of the Churches of Christ. For they seemed good, but they were secretly evil, reaffirming something that atheists love to say, that there is no hate like Christian love. The Churches of Christ remained evil. And it was rather obvious, except to people in the self-declared skeptic community, that this was a ridiculous thing to say, that he eagerly brings up slavery himself to point out that they opposed it, but then comes up with an explanation for why they oppose it that allows him to continue seeing them as evil. And we're supposed to just go along with that. We're supposed to just accept that the Churches of Christ are in fact still evil, that they didn't really have a moral stance against slavery or racism or segregation, that they only pretended to so that they could shift the hate to the outsider and the apostate. Because as Owen Morgan had explained very detailedly in his video, the Churches of Christ hate anyone who's not in the Churches of Christ, say that everyone who's not in the Churches of Christ are just damned to hell, see them as pure evil, and tell you not to have anything to do with them. If you join the Churches of Christ, you are not even allowed to be friends with anyone outside of it. You are not encouraged. You are, in fact, actively discouraged from pursuing higher education. And if you do, they will force you to go to one of their own schools. They hate anyone outside of the church, and they wish to completely control you. In fact, if you ever stop going to a Church of Christ, they will send people after you to try and force you back in. They'll send the elders to pursue you. And of course, all that is sheer nonsense. I left the Churches of Christ, and no one came to pursue me, to force me back into the cult. I've been friends and even married to people who are not in the Churches of Christ. What's your point? Oh, and more, of course, then they'll go back to it's congregational. Your congregation may not have been like that, but others are. It's congregational. You can't tell. And that's one of the problems I keep running into when I discuss the Churches of Christ. I will tell them, someone will tell me that the Church of Christ believes X, and I tell them, no, the Church of Christ does not teach X. And they'll say, well, maybe your congregation didn't, but there are others that do. The Churches of Christ are congregational, you know. Each one different. It differs between which congregation you go to. It's silly over time hearing this. It simply isn't the way the Churches of Christ actually function in the real world, and it simply isn't as awful as people depict it as being. Well, my voice is about to give out, and I have discussed this topic before in the past, and probably will again in the future, because, well, my channel is small, and I have no guarantee that anyone is bothering to listen to even this one, especially considering it is almost an hour and a half long, so I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.